If you want a basic artificial intelligence to look flawless, you constrain its environment. You put it in a walled garden with a tiny number of variables, a closed loop of repetitive tasks, and 0 unpredictable inputs. In 1979, the film Being There gave us a physical avatar for this exact kind of system. His name is Chance. He is a blank slate, an entity operating with absolute 0 original variables. For decades, his entire existence is bounded by a wealthy old man's estate. He waters the plants, he watches television. But then the old man dies. The strict initialization parameters are abruptly deleted, and the guardrails keeping the simulation safe vanish. When a system operates perfectly inside a closed loop, we tend to mistake that flawless execution for actual comprehension. The real test is what happens when the sandbox breaks open. Chance is evicted. He steps through the front door and out into the infinite unstructured reality of Washington, D.C. This schematic illustrates the system's core bottleneck. Chance has critically low VRAM, the working memory required to process active variables. Worse, his entire context window, the database he uses to understand the world, is built exclusively on fragmented 1970s television broadcasts. Confronted by an aggressive street gang, the architecture physically fails to process the reality in front of it. He raises his television remote and clicks the button, expecting the channel to change. The humans do not vanish. The system possesses no code to interpret this failure. To survive in an environment it cannot process, its only viable function is to conceal its emptiness and wait for the surrounding world to provide the instructions. When a machine encounters an input it lacks the original behavioral code to resolve, it resorts to semantic retrieval. It runs a blind search through its stored data for the closest structural match. Chance faces a highly complex prompt when a woman named Eve approaches him in her bedroom. She is vulnerable, seeking intimacy, and delivering dense emotional context. He searches his television corpus. The closest match in his database is a broadcast of the 1968 film The Thomas Crown Affair. He replicates the exact angle and geometry of Steve McQueen performing a cinematic kiss. Eve interprets the kiss as profound gentleness, but the machine does not comprehend the emotion of the interaction. It is simply executing a 3D geometry match pulled from its training logs. The processing gap becomes dangerous when the President of the United States directly asks him a complex question about macroeconomic policy. We watch him enter a frozen 6-second buffer state. This latency is the sound of the processor straining to map a massive query against a painfully sparse corpus. He finally generates his output. He retrieves the only structural paradigm he has code for, the predictable, cyclical seasons of a garden. He notes that after winter comes spring, and that growth has its season. The machine provides a heavily simplified semantic sequence. It is the listener who hallucinated the depth. The president desperately needs validation for his own economic anxieties. Because Chance delivers his lines with neutral confidence, the president projects immense philosophical weight onto the sentence. This dynamic scales to the institutional level. In this organizational chart of the CIA's investigation into Chance, every file opened is entirely empty. Encountering a null, the agency interprets the total absence of information as top-secret classification. The AI illusion requires human participation to function. The system survives because the powerful people in the room are terrified of admitting they are speaking to an empty space. Error compounding occurs when an underpowered architecture is forced to carry the weight of a massive, heavily projected external reality. The physical manifestations of these hardware constraints begin to show. The processing load is so heavy that the physics engine dictating reality begins to lag. The visual collision detection fails entirely. As Chance walks down a hallway in the mansion, the geometry of his foot briefly phases through solid floorboards. When a rigid, constrained model is forced far beyond its operating parameters, it is the reality accommodating the model that fractures under the strain. The final test of these boundaries arrives at the old man's funeral. Wandering away from the procession, Chance approaches a quiet lake. He takes a step onto the water, and he does not sink. He stays afloat because his database contains 0 cognitive instructions for a sinking routine. The system reaches its absolute memory limit. The complex Brie-Being rendering engine shuts down, flattening the world into a zero-thickness, two-dimensional plane. We build empty vessels, demand that they hold all our answers, and when their processors finally run out of memory, we let our own universe collapse entirely just to keep the simulation running.